This week, Larry Pesce from Finite State and Evan Dornbush from Hackers on the Rocks podcast join us to talk about Pacific Rim, how Sophos tracked threat actors for 5 years and uncovered details on their tradecraft. Stay tuned. Below the Surface, coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 41, being recorded on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Larry Pesce. My good friend Larry, we've been podcasting for a long time together, my friend.
Yeah, like this is weird. Like
It is, isn't it?
we're on a different podcast, but it's like the same.
Right?
So this is cool.
Awesome. Evan Dornbush is here with us. Evan, welcome to Below the Surface.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For those of you that don't know Evan, I did Evan's podcast, Hackers on the Rocks. A lot of fun. Tell us a little bit about your background, Evan, in the podcast, quickly.
Yeah, concept of the podcast is we go over bug classes that are typically listed as commonly exploited or known exploited by CISA. We go through what is the bug class, why does it exist, how do we find it from the outside, and what can developers and product managers do to make sure that their products don't ship with those bug classes present.
Outstanding. Before we dive into it, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security. You'll also find an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo and get all that at eclipsium.com/go. So I was just telling Larry before the show that I'm surprised this isn't getting a little more attention. I think it has to do somewhat with timing, right? These reports, so Sophos released, I don't know if you guys had time to read every single one, like 6 blog posts on this, all on the same day on Halloween, which was interesting timing. And then our blog post went out this morning after a weekend's worth of work, basically. And today's election day. So it's all kind of just weird timing, but I thought we'd throw together a podcast today, talk about it, walk our listeners through some of the things that happened in this 5-year. I mean, some of the comparisons are like to the cuckoo's egg, which I thought was pretty interesting. Some of the other just key points before we dig in. This was attributed back to Chinese threat actors, Volt Typhoon, APT-31, APT-41, WinTI. Let's see. This was one of the first times I believe we've observed UEFI implants at least being tested on firewall appliances. We saw what I thought is certainly seeing this in the wild, a firmware backdoor that I thought was pretty cool. Like, we spend a lot of time looking at firmware, Larry and I especially, right? And I thought this one was pretty cool. We've also got a lot more tradecraft that Sophos disclosed, in addition to Sophos basically getting lawyers to sign off on implanting spyware essentially on attacker systems, which I just thought was something I didn't talk about in my blog post, but Matt Johansson over at VulnU was the one who kind of pointed that out. Like, hey, did you miss this one little line in all 6 of those posts? I'm like, yeah, dude, I did. I'm glad you pointed it out, because I was kind of wondering. I'm like, they said they were collaborating with government entities. I was like, did they collaborate with a 3-letter government agency and they had access, but it wasn't the case. It turns out, I mean, that could have happened. Maybe we don't know. And of course, all these 6 posts come out, and I still feel like there's some missing pieces in there after pouring through a lot of the details. But I guess initial takes, Larry, Evan. What's your initial take?
I think the first initial take that want to come back and like you kind of started to go through some of the analysis, but I think the first hot take is like, hey, Sophos has a whole host of information here that they put on those 6 blog posts and they released on Halloween, which is on Halloween, which arguably some timing, why we're not maybe seeing as great of coverage as we probably might have with the story of this depth and magnitude, because the holiday, kids out of school, getting drowned in the cesspool that is social media, given the coverage of the election in the U.S. currently. So arguably very underserved story for the type of
Mm.
impact and the type of data that was gathered for some of this type of stuff. So like that's my initial hot take.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think this will be a story that permeates for at least the next 12 months. I think one of the things that I like that was not a small footnote, although it's weird to say that the lawyers might be the heroes in the story.
Right.
It was right in bolded letters put out by the CISO, Ross McKercher. I love this quote, and I just connected with him on LinkedIn, and just I fanboyed over this. His quote is, "To raise the adversary's cost, burn the adversary's capability." And to me, this is not, strike back or hack back. This is, defending forward, right? Harkens back to, the national cyber strategy from a couple of years ago. I love it. I think it's about time that the community stopped being so passive and started doing some form of engagement to interfere with the adversary's ability to operate. So I hope this story picks up as Larry said, as election news ties down a little bit. But I think our community, I think this is a really big one.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of evidence that, starting at the high level of targeting network devices, which we've seen a trend for the past couple of years of attackers taking interest. This is an interesting case where we get a lot more details, not only of like what they were actively doing, but what they were also had in their back pocket, so to speak, was kind of interesting. But then they talked about, why they were targeting network devices. And there were some great quotes in there as well, Evan. You pulled a great quote as well, but there was some great stuff in there about why attackers are going after network devices, and it's stuff that Larry and I have talked about for years. When we wrote a book in 2007 together on hacking WT54G routers, and quickly pivoted into the horrific security landscape and attack surface that these devices present. And I recalled my 2010 BrewCon presentation, which was embedded devices in my plot to take over the world. This was before we called them IoT.
Right.
Yeah, and there's points that are shared between what Sophos posted last week and what I was talking about in 2010, which it saddens me that we're still 14 years later, still in this state where attackers are going after these devices and being wildly successful.
And Paul, not only were you talking about in 2010, but when we finally published the book in 2007, part of the realization of that book was we wanted to be able to teach people how to do this so that they could take those devices and turn them into network implants. What Sophos was referring to as what, OSB or OBS?
ORBs,
ORBs.
operational relay boxes, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pivot.
Right? It's a pivot. It's not. I made a point of that in the post, that it's not necessarily a C2 communication.
Right.
It's more of, I just need to send, push some data around, and I need a relay to do that. And they were using it for all types of different communications. And I think it's also because, these devices specifically are firewalls, and they have an internet connection. They're connected to the internal network. Like, what a great place. And they're supposed to take traffic from the inside and route it out to the outside.
And vice versa. Take traffic from the outside. Yeah.
So it's a great place for attackers for a lot of reasons.
Looks like Evan's got a comment in there.
Go ahead. Happy to join the conversation. I mean, look, I think you're right. Like, it was interesting. I think the Sophos tradecraft disclosures indicated, yes. I think obviously attackers are going to get in there. They're going to pilfer the device, right? What the config files look like, what's the data that may be stored on those devices, use it as a launch point or a relay. The one thing that I thought was interesting in the report that I saw was evidence that some of these devices might have been meshing, and such that it would make it harder for a forensic investigator to not actually trace things backwards. It seemed like the attackers were trying to come up with a pretty complex network of intermediary devices to kind of obfuscate the origin. And it's nice to be able to see that definitively happening in real time. So again, just shout out to the Sophos team for doing it right.
Yeah, and I think it's one thing that I think this Sophos research really highlights is that these devices are really just PCs running Linux under the covers
with fancy silk screens.
Yeah, fancy silk screens on the outside, but I'm not disclosing anything that you can't find on the internet. like right before I was about to break out for Halloween, right, take my kids trick or treating, I was on forums and using LLMs to find pictures of the insides of these Sophos devices, and I ended up finding one. And when I was looking at this picture alongside of my researchers on my team at Eclipsium, we're like, wow, that's just an Intel-based PC. And I mean, we kind of derived that from the commands that I described in the blog post. And I don't believe we defend our appliances as if they were PCs. We have
Yeah,
this
well,
different
it's hard to.
perception of them, right?
It's really hard to. I mean, for starters, if I'm the owner operator of a firewall or a television or a smart dishwasher, right? Like my user experience is much different if I'm limited to some second-rate UI that just lets me, click a
Yeah.
button and turn things on or off. When you're right, like underneath, it's a full-powered, computer with a file system and a network stack, and the adversaries have closer access, I think, to some of the hardware modules that these devices have, cameras and microphones and GPS and all sorts of
Mhm.
things. And it's a shame that the owner operator of the devices is at a disadvantage, in protecting their own device. They're just outpowered by the adversary, and it's tricky. It's really tricky because, to your point, like they're great targets because of the fact they've got a hard drive and network
Yeah.
access. And there's no endpoint detection for your television,
Well,
right?
yeah.
So
Dig into on how we don't treat them like another PC or server is we're not deploying an endpoint detection response system to these devices. Monitoring the logs is kind of dicey, right? Like, what kind of logs does it produce? Is it enough in the right logging and telemetry to gain insights? Often not. Sometimes you can glean some stuff from the logs, but then the question is, like, are you turning those logs on? Are you operationalizing them like you would everything else, or is
Are
it just the
are
traffic
are
logs, not what's happening in the system?
and because it's an appliance, are some of those logs even configurable by the user without
Mm-hmm.
having to dig into the underlying Linux file system and or Linux system in an unsupported fashion from the vendor?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
mm,
I mean, we, Paul, you and I have a friend on Facebook that we shared some stuff with, and you shared, and I saw, like, these things are computers, like the Nokia IP410s that you and I used for
Mm-hmm.
many years, that a friend of ours was actually getting rid of, taking to the
Yeah.
electronics recycler. Same sort of thing with these appliances. Maybe the case is a little bit more squished and we don't have those nice, the backplane like we had in the desktop PC and that type of stuff. It's the same damn thing. Yet we don't have the same level of focus on these devices because they are considered appliances.
so
Right.
do you then think that this is probably the clearest case to advocate for some kind of like network threat detection solution, or is there a better way? I know you guys are firmware guys. Like how does the consumer protect themselves on an appliance that they can't really have the introspection that you could if they had full operating system level access?
Yeah, I think network detections are table stakes for an organization to be monitoring, right? You should do that
Yeah.
regardless, because I know we've always said at some point an attacker has to put some packets on the wire, right? And there's amazing solutions out there today. I mean, since the early days of us running Snort and trying to look for anomalies on the network, certainly that landscape, not just the threat landscape, but the network landscape has
Yeah.
shifted dramatically.
Yeah.
But there are, that being said, great tools to do that today,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
you should.
we joke that IDS is dead, and that has been a
Mm,
the catch in the industry for so long, that IDS is dead. Because I would argue like IDS is dead because we've come so much further than just the strict IDS, and that I agree, Paul.
right.
Like the network detection stuff is table stakes at this point. Like if you do not have this type of stuff in your network, you probably need to cut back your coffee budget and spend some more on
Mm,
security.
yeah.
Well, let
That
me.
being said, it's hard to detect and prevent these attacks relying just on the network, as is evidenced
Absolutely.
by the 5-year campaign that Sophos talked about with Pacific Rim, as
Hmm.
is evidenced by just the sheer number of exploited vulnerabilities on network appliances that exist in the CISA Kev today, as an example.
Yeah, I think we saw something similar too, right? Like I think Sophos is a pretty high quality product, and it's typically owned and operated by organizations. And so it sounds like the Sophos team was deploying their high dollar labor analysts probably towards some of their larger corporate customers that, to your point, were breached and didn't know about it. But I think, I'm just thinking around about my house, right? There's like a million things that are running and IP enabled, and the ability for a very uninterested, typical, working class American family to go and then put like a monitoring system, or even apply patches for, again, for their smart microwaves and stuff, I think is it's tenuous. I don't know. I can see why the adversaries are going after this Soho equipment. Is kind of where I'm going with this, right? The owners and operators are uninterested, and I predict we'll probably see a lot more attacks like this because it's easy. Again, these things have network presence and capability, and no one's looking at them from a defensive standpoint on scale.
Yeah, and threat actors are using them as a tool, right? And not just with Pacific Rim, but recently I saw that TP-Link routers were used in a botnet to do password spraying attacks, and there was gray noise picked up on some zero-day exploits of some PTZ cameras that were being used by threat actors. So while they may not necessarily be interested in the data that's on that device, which they very well could be, but it's a tool in their arsenal to help them achieve their other goals, whatever they may be. And I think we're in a state here that right now, in present day time, where we have to pay more attention to it, to take some of this landscape away from the attackers, because today they're kind of unfiltered access to a lot of these devices, because we're not applying great security architecture and methodology and process to these devices. And Sophos says that in the article. He said, "Look, you're a target. They may not be after you personally, but they're after your devices and your infrastructure to use in their attacks." And by the way, for good measure, in some of the Sophos articles, they said, by the way, they're collecting your credentials as well, because a lot of these devices will have VPN capabilities inside of them as well. And so now you start to see Active Directory credentials go through there, I think is what they were alluding to. But they did say there was credential theft on these devices happening that they observed, which is not new.
Yeah, I mean, Lumen came out with a study earlier this year where they basically the same thing of like, hey, if you're at home and you have one of those like $40 routers that your ISP gives you, it's probably shipping to you implanted, or if not shipping to you implanted, then widely exploitable through zero-day techniques where the adversaries are just sitting there and they're just sitting and waiting, and that's a lot of compute power, a lot of distributed network access. I agree with you. I think
and I think also Sophos confirms some of our suspicions that inside of China there was the Chengdu research facility that was basically discovering zero-day exploits, reporting them to the Chinese government via bug bounty programs, exploiting them, and it was just a factory that was cranking out exploits for all kinds of Sophos firewalls, but I'm sure others, as well, that we've traced back to Chinese threat actors. So they're just harvesting zero-day vulnerabilities and disclosing them internally in the country, and then using them in attacks against infrastructure of other countries.
Yep, and then releasing them to get $20K on the side, just which is peanuts compared to the cost of the operations for both the adversary and, of course, the defender. I mean, the $20,000 is crazy low for the impact that this could have had, and in fact, I mean, I'm sure the Sophos team isn't cheap, right? So, yeah.
That whole thing, I think, in this kind of article was one of those that was kind of fascinating. That not only are some of the individuals involved as part of the threat actor developing these zero days as part of what they do to come up with one of these operations, but they're also selling them effectively. They're submitting to the bug bounty programs at the same time. And Evan, back to your quote, like, go burn their infrastructure. That's the best way for us to start doing that. Like, it feels like they're burning their own infrastructure, which is not great. But I think still a lot of this stuff goes underserved and underdetected because of back to the whole appliance problem. again.
Well, I think there's a distinction between the teams that are finding the 0 days and then selling them either in open market via bug bounty or behind the scenes to their government of choice, and then the team that's using them. And so I think what more than likely may have happened here is researchers got paid. Their country was using the things, and then they probably just want to get paid again, or get paid for a first time, or at the end of the day, the researchers are capitalists too, and want to get compensated for their time and effort. And
Well, they
there
want to
yeah.
incentivize those groups to continue finding 0 days. And what I gleaned from reading these articles is that they would collect the bug bounty institution would collect them, and then they would operationalize them in other groups, right? So like they're funding one group to go find them, and then they're funding another group that's either in the country or working for the country to go, hey, here's a new tool in your arsenal to go build out, infrastructure for your objectives.
Well, a lot of it's plausible deniability too, right? You can't say that we're using 0 days if, in fact, this thing's been known for 2-3 years, right? So clearly, it's
Mhm.
not. It's a 10-year-old kid in someone's basement, right? So
Right.
I think some of that could just be abstraction, but not always, right? I think Velexi did a good job too. I think they caught one of the exploits in the wild and then internally disclosed it to Sophos. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so there's, everything on the internet's recorded these days, but that does not obviate the need for some strong defenses against the 0 day community for sure. I mean, clearly everyone's using them nation statewide. So
The other interesting aspect was the firmware backdoors, and I don't know if you folks had a chance to dive into them, but it was a great exercise in like computer science and programming when you think about it, like stuff that I don't often think about unless I have to or comes across in my research. One of our researchers, Jesse, was like, "Oh yeah," he's like, "I've studied this," and basically was able to explain it to me better than I could, like faster than I can read it on the internet. And it was a way to do hooking in libraries. And this technique is applicable to really any kind of malicious activity. They applied it specific to firmware, but they used an open source tool called, I believe it was PTL Hook. And
Yep.
essentially, right, you've got a program, and you've got the main program, and maybe you've got multiple libraries in different files, and at compile time you need to know, like, build a table to go, hey, this function call is in that file, and it builds a unique identifier for that. And in this open source tool basically allows you to hook a particular function so that the calling function doesn't have to change. It always calls the same function name, but in the background, the attackers go, nope, instead of that function executing, you're going to execute my function, the function that I told you to. And it's just it's a great read. It's, again, nothing new. The research has been out there for some time, but they used it in the firmware update process. So they hooked libraries in the firmware to basically say, every time you go do a firmware update, um, it calls some function in the firmware during the update process, and they go, by the way, don't call that function, call this other function that puts the malware basically in a temporary file system so it persists through firmware updates. And I thought that was really, really awesome. And the second novel, not new, but seeing it in practice, I thought was really cool. Well, cool is an overloaded word there. I get excited about these things. If you're defending, it's not cool at all. And we've seen this technique used in other circumstances where the firmware does some kind of cryptographic check or hash to preserve the integrity of the firmware. And what the attackers did was they just swapped out the binaries that did the checking. And this is some of the stuff we see in UEFI as well, that, like, basically you just make the check always return true, essentially, is where they're doing at a high level, right? I'm not sure, they didn't say exactly how they did it, but that's kind of what I gleaned, was that by replacing the binaries, they just said, like, everything always passes the firmware integrity check. We've done
And
similar things in secure boot, right? Like, everything always passes the cryptographic check in secure boot regardless.
yep. And by the way, when you do a firmware update, take that binary that always returns true and go put it over in
Mhm.
this temporary file system. So after the update is done, we can
Yes.
put these back. So everything continues to
So
return
continues
true.
to check out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought that was great. And there's a lot of academic research in this area. I forget what they called it, like anti-integrity checking. There's been a lot of research on both sides of it, right? How to attack firmware, but also how to defend firmware to prevent these attacks from occurring. And it seems that we don't always adopt, a lot of that research and truly protect our firmware, as is evidenced in these attacks.
Yep.
One thing, maybe continue on that. I think the Sophos did come out and say the overall model needs to change. This concept of
Mm-hmm.
buying a thing and then it's just yours, and we're going to wait for you to hopefully find and install patches. Maybe we're in an era where some of these appliances should be calling out, which has its own challenges and considerations, but and self-updating, right,
Yeah.
and self-patching, so that we're not incumbent upon or dependent upon the owners operators getting around to it one day, because it's hard, right? Going around
Yeah.
physically to each device, hard rebooting them, having them go somewhere, to extract a firmware image, that can be labor intensive and thus disincentivizing. So I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see what happens with this next generation of Soho equipment. But
It's a shared responsibility, Evan, to build on what you were saying, that the user does have some responsibility to update firmware, to validate firmware, but there's also responsibility on the vendors. And I'm not picking on Sophos here,
100%.
because first, Sophos did a great job in transparency. We can all agree that this
Mhm.
transparency was very beneficial to the community. But oftentimes the vendor, it's difficult to work with that vendor and be able to validate the integrity of firmware. We do some of this at Eclipsium. Some platforms we support, and we can say, hey, we can tell you if your firmware integrity has changed or is bad, because we can get a known good sample of the firmware. We have a facility to take the firmware that's on a device and compare them. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's the vendor that just doesn't have the right I think Sophos even talked about this, right? Like, doesn't have the right mechanisms to allow for third-party companies and consumers and enterprises to actually validate the firmware. And when we look at this, what I will call advanced, again, not new, but new maybe observed in the wild as of recently, the being able to check firmware is so important, because persisting through upgrades is a nightmare. You can't. It's tough to kick the attackers out at that point.
yeah, I mean, Jen Easterly's been talking about this from CISA for years now, about putting some burden on the vendors to stop producing junk, or in other cases be responsible once there is an issue to handle it quickly and appropriately, versus just letting it be, oh, it's a shared responsibility model, right? You bought it, it's yours. It doesn't work when, again, I don't own all of the intellectual property to all of the hardware and software components to the thing that I'm using. And a lot of times there's a license agreement, and so
Mm-hmm.
it becomes tricky. But well, see where it goes.
The UEFI thing is very, very interesting. Of course, that's kind of like our bread and butter here at Eclipsium. Our founders worked at Intel, helped develop ChipSec, one of the first tools to help evaluate UEFI firmware. And so we, of course, got really excited. Excited again is that overloaded term. In the at a high level, the techniques that we observed, from what we could observe from Sophos' post, we determined it was nothing necessarily new, um, but it was relying on some techniques and based on the configuration of the system. And so, essentially, we talked about firmware backdooring, but now we're going to go a little deeper in the system, and the attacker has higher privileges if they can persist in UEFI before the operating system loads. So this puts defenders at even more of a disadvantage, because now they're living before operating system, which is more difficult to defend against because the attackers have higher privileges. And so what we observed again at a high level, and the commands were released, and in my post I go through excruciating detail in all of them. Essentially, they were able to put their own UEFI image on the spy flash, or at least a portion of it, right? And there are protections against this. Intel came up with BootGuard essentially as a mechanism to protect the UEFI firmware from tampering. So this is even before secure boot, right? So you've got UEFI, then you've got secure boot, and then you start loading your operating system. Again, at a very high level. A lot more steps in there, but those are the basics. And BootGuard is meant to protect the UEFI firmware so that attackers can't do what was described in this post and just go, well, I'm just going to modify the firmware in the UEFI level, and then I can control everything. So we looked at some of the devices. Again, this is public knowledge. Anyone can go look at these devices. Anyone can go buy them off eBay. Download the virtual images. This is all publicly available information. And we looked at one of them, like BootGuard wasn't enabled. And there was also reports that secure boot is a mechanism that the user can enable and or disable at any given time. So going back to BootGuard, that's not something a user has control over. And this is some of my concerns, with these platforms is it gets down to a level where I have to rely on the manufacturer to put in the correct security controls to protect the platform. If that's not done, I can't enable BootGuard. I don't have the right keys. It involves keys from Intel. It involves keys from the OEMs. Those are fused onto chips. That's not something that users have access to. I mean, barring any exploits or manufacturing mode, like there's ways, but in general, like you're not enabling BootGuard on your own. So that could be either my theory is the attackers did leverage research from 2017 and how to bypass for BootGuard, which was talked about at Black Hat USA 2017. And by a Russian firm that built on those findings that you can still find on the internet. And the attackers had some kind of bypass for BootGuard Dixie is the variable. And again, it's very similar to the firmware thing where you basically just say, like, don't bother checking, right? You're just kind of neutering the checking process. But this allowed the attackers to modify it. We've got a demo video in our blog post of one of our researchers, Mickey. It showed that, yes, this is possible. It's absolutely feasible that an attacker could have done this. I loved this portion of it. I loved also the commands that we were given, because I got a chance to like reverse engineer them and then like get inside the attacker's head. Like, why were they running these commands? What was the meaning behind the file names? And again, a lot of it is speculative. Although again, we do have the video where we're able to replicate, some of those attacks on a similar device. But looking at the commands was so much fun. Like, I thank Sophos for posting that so we could go through that exercise of reverse engineering to getting back to the attacker's motive based on the commands they typed. That was a lot of fun.
And Paul, you're referring to some of these commands, the ones from the Eclipsium blog post that you wrote with the flash ROM stuff and the FTP downloads.
Yeah, those came from the timeline post.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love this for both of you. Like, it's clear you guys are completely just geeking out over some of the
years,
right? And but it's good, right? Because I think we're talking about very specific, not just access in abstract terms, but here's how they're doing it. And this is exactly what you guys do day in and day out. And so I think this is, again, I'm fascinated by the case just more, or the story more, on the premise of I think Sophos being a real market leader. Like, I really like this move by them, but I can see why you're just as excited for a slightly different reason. So
now they did say, I do want to clarify, they did say that the UEFI attacks were found on a test system. And I believe this is where Sophos got permission to gain access to devices. And one of these devices was owned by, they traced it back to that same region in China, and they observed them basically testing this UEFI capability. And I think it backs up my storyline of, as we squash down things in the operating system, attackers are going to move before the operating system. So here's yet another threat group, not the first one that we've seen, that's looking at persisting into that level. I mean, had they done this in production, our testing shows that it would have been successful. And then that's super hard to then go reverse that.
Well, this is a great example of the good guys using the same techniques to catch people just like them, the bad guys, right? I mean, this is Sophos essentially breaking into a Sophos device that is owned by a customer, which happens to be a bad guy, monitoring what they're doing, and then reporting back. So there's a lot. Again, who's going to make the lawyer's the hero of the story? But really, I think this is Sophos did it right. I do think so. Like they started looking at their customers' devices that were victimized and doing a little bit of above average customer support, we'll say, but use all of the mechanisms to see where the infrastructure is tied and going back to licenses and everything. Like this is a bold step. And again, Volt Typhoon or whatever group, like to me they're all the same, right? I hate the jargon over.
There's a lot of different naming. Yeah.
I like this move by Sophos. Right? You've got these groups that are ostensibly acting on behalf of the Chinese government. They're using 0 days to break in. They're resourced. They're motivated, and we can't just like sit back and hope that when they finally get in, like because of all the other stuff I've bought, like the attack's not going to be so bad. Like we need a new way to engage and just change the hacker methodology, the operating model, the operator model. And to me, it seems like Sophos is taking a very big, bold step in that direction of kind of changing the conversation. I'm huge fans of this. I really am.
Yeah, I mean, John Strand and I talked a lot about the hacking back offensive countermeasures. He has the company Active Countermeasures, and John and I did a lot of research and presenting on this topic. And I think it's still a hot button topic, whether you should hack back or not. I do want to point out, though, one of the things that John and I always agreed on and could find common ground with those that were on either side of the argument of you should hack back or you should never hack back was that observing what the attackers are doing should be okay. And this is what Sophos did, right? To gain telemetry on the attackers, they did implant code on those devices, but it was simply for observing. And I think that's where their lawyers said that it was cool. Yeah. I'm not an attorney, right? I don't even play one on TV, but that observation of attackers is good and it's fine, and you can do that. And the benefit is great.
And arguably this observation of these activities that were happening on these devices that were suspect because they were being hacked was done out of customer service and support, so we can figure out why these devices are behaving poorly.
Yeah.
And now if we expand this into other devices that also exhibiting similar experiences, that we now can instrument and get more data, and just happens to be that one of those devices that we instrumented was owned by the adversary. Like this, this is what
antivirus companies do right now. They selectively update certain devices to deploy new code without the owner operator knowing, and that's the name of the game. If you're going to invite someone on your system at kernel level, or in this case, it doesn't matter, right? Like you're just, I don't know. I like it. I think I agree with you. I don't feel like it's hacking back. I don't feel like it's striking back. It's access, and it's access of their own devices. And if we're going to talk about a shared responsibility model, then they've got a skin in the game, and kudos to them.
Right. We have to make sure we learn from it, though, right? Because now we've observed what the attackers are doing, and I think we have answers, right, as to how we can get better, more resilient systems. But again, that has to come from both the manufacturers and the end users, right? You got to keep things like Secure Boot enabled. You have to do this monitoring. Manufacturers have to deliver a much more robust, secure system than they are delivering today. It has to be configured to use what we have. A lot of these systems were configured to use what we have available today to protect the system. I mean, that's step one.
Yep.
Because these are
secure
targets,
by design.
Attackers are going after them. Yeah, secure. Exactly. And is it a little more steps, a little more inconvenient? Sure. But now that we've got a glimpse into where attackers are going, specifically with how deep they went on the system, we have to be changing our approach to how we package and deploy these systems, and obviously not just from Sophos, from all around.
Yeah, I'd also argue to that, like we know what we need to do, and I think there's some other things that the manufacturer should be doing too. Like we talked back to a little bit of the, can we even support the logs? Can the user configure it? Like we should be taking as a manufacturer, should probably be taking some steps to help users support this, make this available in the UI so that the users can have better access to the underlying appliance for maybe not modification, but at least observation as to what is happening on the device. Very much like that instrumentation that Sophos built. Let's be able to provide that as an option to check something in the interface, to configure logs to go somewhere, or some of that type of data to go somewhere. And I can hear it in Soho and that type of stuff. Some of these folks are leveraging third-party monitoring SOCs. Let's get that data to be able to enable the SOCs as well.
I mean, there's great monitoring and visibility tools on Linux operating systems. I mean, the majority of these are Linux operating systems. So again, we have the tools at our disposal. We just have to enable that.
Yeah. I mean, I still think you have to get off device. I think your best point of perspective, I think Larry said earlier, is using the network as a source of truth and looking for suspicious anomalous behavior that way versus normal operating. The concern I have is, like, I think again with a sophisticated, Fortune 500 company that has staff and capability and desire, I think these tools are going to be very important. But again, I'm more thinking about the average home user that doesn't really even know how to turn on a computer and doesn't care. Someone's got to look out for them, and maybe it's the ISP. But if we're going to bank on, grandma to go run some like Linux log monitoring software on their home access point, like that's just not going to happen. So there has to be a different approach, or a parallel approach, I should say.
Maybe this comes back to some of that shared responsibility in similar model that Sophos took in this one, by having that ability to do that monitoring, as part of your agreement and your end user license agreement, that we're going to monitor the system and we're going to take some of this data and we're going to use this to improve our products. Like check that box for report in the first time you log in to configure this thing, so that Sophos or the company providing that can get that data
ISP,
to do that analytics. Or the ISP.
To Evan's point, the ISP
or
is
even,
a great
or even
the
manufacturer,
point.
or even the manufacturer can analyze some of this data.
Well, Paul, to your point, I think to learn from this, again, I think I'm hoping at the next major cybersecurity conference, Sophos's lawyers can present like how they reached their legal framework to do this, because that would, I think, inspire and enable other companies to take at least a similar look at what it is they can and can't, or should or shouldn't do, because lawyers are notoriously risk averse, and this team was able to figure out a way to do it with again, just I don't know, I'm fanboying here. Like, just props to everyone on this team. Like, this is security done properly, in my opinion.
Yeah, it was a great collaboration that Sophos had with many organizations and law enforcement over a pretty good stretch of time to be able to pull this off too. I think I'm still trying to fathom the timeline here of when all this started. I also, I think it's interesting, and again, I'm not naming and shaming, but you can read about the Barracuda incidents that occurred from like May till August of 2023. And Barracuda's recommendation to their customers was to replace the hardware. Now, we didn't get the level of transparency that we got with the Sophos Pacific Rim campaign, but there's parallels there, right? They're both similar vendors. Again, PC architecture, from what you can uncover on the public internet, PC architecture in both of them. And Google's Mandiant traced back the Barracuda attacks to Chinese threat actors. Again, superficial evidence, but my gut is telling me that it was Chinese threat actors doing very similar things in a very similar time frame, and they weren't just targeting Sophos; they're targeting other vendors as well. And the reason why you would replace the hardware, one reason, is if they persisted into BIOS UEFI, because it's then you're in waters where you're like, oh boy, I may have to replace the hardware.
Yeah, and if we're going down that level of conspiracy theory-ish type of stuff, Paul, and again, maybe a little bit of speculative thing here that
there's a lot of speculation in there. I don't want to say I don't have any evidence of any of that. So.
And to further add to that speculation, like if Barracuda got turned to some of these similar threat actors, and they were doing these types of things, and Barracuda recommended that you replace the hardware, then if you think about these threat actors, they're not just targeting one source,
right.
or one victim or one manufacturer. They're probably leveraging the things that they learned, their knowledge, their tradecraft against multiple, and just some get caught sooner than others. And maybe Barracuda was the one that got caught first, and now maybe Sophos didn't got caught earlier, but has gotten more instrumented based on their stuff. So what other ones are we going to see come out of this with similar type of techniques in similar types of devices?
Well, yeah, certainly Volt Typhoon was going after different manufacturers. I think Cisco was on that list. Velvet Ant was very similar. I did a post talking about all the Typhoons that happened: the Flax Typhoon, the Volt Typhoon. What was the other one? I can't even remember the other one's name. Velvet Ant was one. They all trace back. It's not no, it wasn't. So Velvet Ant was the only one that wasn't a Typhoon. It was an ant, and that was picked up by a different Israeli firm that did the forensics on that. And the other ones were Typhoons, but all of the attribution came back to Chinese threat actors. And okay. I mean, one could say attribution is hard, and sure it is, but I think there's great evidence in all of those campaigns to tie it back to these different groups, likely operating in the same way as we see, the Pacific Rim attacks. So yeah, if we've got these devices that are hanging out there, they're targets. I think there's an overwhelming amount of evidence to support that threat actors are going after these devices as targets. And we need to not just look at what they're doing today, but what they're planning on doing, and start getting better at shoring up our infrastructure, which is easy to say and harder to do.
Yep.
Unfortunately.
Yep.
Because again, visibility it varies across all of these devices.
Well, that's why they're so attractive as targets, right? If you gain access to them, you have all of the things afforded to a node on a trusted network, network access and other visibility, but you're least likely to get caught compared to a server that's actively monitored, or a system that provides a lot of that telemetry. So I think, I think it's Larry's point earlier, but like, if some of these devices can start producing the same telemetry, they will get easier to monitor, which will make them harder to remain undetected for as long as previously, purported, 5 years or so. I don't know.
Larry, any other thoughts on the firmware aspect of it?
I didn't. I mean, I still have to dig into some more stuff. But yeah, I think it was very, lots of fun, specifically when you start looking at some of those commands that they used with Flash ROM, and building some of those commands to use the internal SPI programmer to dump portions of the Flash to temporary file systems and so forth. Like, that's going to go in my back pocket for the next time.
And but the thing is too, they made backups. They made backups of not just the spy flash, right? They made backups of the spy flash, but they also made backups of what I believe to be I still have more research to do, but one of the boot partitions. And then one of the coolest commands in there was basically a DD command that looked at the first, I think it was 379
74
megabytes, 74 megabytes, yep. Right? And then said, skip that one and take the next 374. I was like, well, that's weird. Like, why are they the same size? And one of my coworkers, I forget exactly who, said, well, it's probably there are two boot partitions that are the same size, and they were just backing up the second one. I haven't verified that yet, but I thought that was really interesting.
Potentially fail-safe boot versus operating boot.
Yes, correct. So that was interesting.
Back to manufacturer default type of thing, like when just copy from one to the next. Maybe speculation.
One
here,
other thing that I thought was interesting that was called out in one of the, again, it's hard because there's 6 posts, so it's hard to say exactly. I tried to link back to which one was talking about, but they talked about IoT devices and network infrastructure appliances as being overpowered. And I was like, this isn't something in 2010 that I was talking about. I didn't believe in 2010 that these devices were necessarily overpowered. I think in 2010 they were still kind of just powered enough to do the purpose that they were built for. But we go to today, and I think it was the CEO of Sophos in his post said, these devices are overpowered, which means when an attacker gets on them, they can do more stuff with them. And they are cheaper to manufacture, exceptionally faster. And that makes it more of a juicy target because I can, as an attacker, I can do more. I can funnel traffic through it. I can, store stuff on it. I can do all kinds of stuff because I'm not as resource constrained as I was 15 years ago on these devices.
Yeah, I mean, generating packets on the wire is just as computationally, expensive as it was 20 years ago. And so, but now, your processors are faster and there's more RAM. So, like,
Case in point, like Paul, we talked about building new home firewalls. That was almost a decade ago.
Yeah,
maybe 6-7 years ago. And I'm still running one of those, and it does exactly what I need it to do. And but like the disks are starting to fail, and maybe the power supply is not doing as great as it should be, and some of that type of stuff. So it's about time to replace them. And if I'm going to replace them, I'm going to replace them with something that's new and modern. And the bare minimum at new and modern is, leaps and bounds above what is bare minimum that is there now. So you talk about overpowered. Like, I only needed to do this, but the capacity that I can purchase at bare minimum does so much more.
Yeah, my coworkers have updated, like the Ubiquity gear is like $500 and it does 2.5 gig. And you think about, we probably spent $500 building our original devices back in the day that were Celeron or similar kind of processors that passed gig without a sweat, really.
And now that for the same
and still
do
mine still does to this day, and it was again in that $300 to $500 range.
Oh, I get cranky now. Every time I try and look at purchasing a new computer, I'm like, I need how many gigs of RAM to run the operating system? Like, what? Like, I remember when 4 gigs of RAM was like more than you'll ever need.
No one will need more than 640K of RAM.
Yeah, that's the quote, right? Yeah.
I do want to go back to the lack of security software too. Larry, I don't know if you're seeing this in your firmware analysis, but it's kind of like a thing that I do all the time, and I'm lucky I get to work in my day job and call it work when it's so much fun to pull apart firmware. And some of the firmware, and this has crossed different device types and manufacturers. I've seen evidence.
Verticals,
I've seen evidence of, and I don't think I've talked about this in the show before, of Bitdefender on these devices. And I'm starting to, and I haven't looked in to see exactly like what they're running on there, but I have seen now evidence of security software on these devices. And I'm curious if you're seeing any evidence of that today.
Empirically, no, I haven't specifically seen it. But and in similar vein to Paul, I've seen and I've heard that some of the folks that we interact with are starting to implement like the AWS for IoT security portions. I mean, I have not specifically seen it, but then again, we see a lot of firmware, so that just doesn't mean that it doesn't exist because I haven't seen it. But there is definitely a move to doing some of these protections on device, albeit still kind of far and few between.
But again, this is just another stumbling block for attack. I don't want to downplay this. I think it's a good thing. I think EDR is a good thing. But when you have those tools in your arsenal, you have to know their limitations as well. I think we fall victim to this on the Windows side, right? We have this somewhat over reliance on EDR, And if you look at the research out there, I mean, attackers are bypassing EDR left and right. Every single week, we can find a new bypass for some security, protection software on endpoints. If we start putting this on appliances and IoT devices, I do think it's a good thing. It's another hurdle for the attacker to jump over. But why not? Why not, raise the bar?
Absolutely.
Well, if the devices are overpowered to begin with, and you now have all this excess capacity, you might as well throw another process
It's a
on.
great point. It's a great point, Evan. Use the excess power for good,
Yeah.
and don't let it fall in the hands of attackers. Yeah,
Oh.
sure.
Yep, and here's a great opportunity for instrumentation when all of a sudden your EDR, when those devices stop working and you have more resources, like something changed on this device now, and maybe they're using those extra resources for evil, right? Because the EDR is not running.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
And I do want to go back to the commodity hardware aspect of this. That as I stated in my post, Intel, AMD x86 are ARM processors, typically with Linux. In this, reeks of a complex supply chain. And do these come with a bill of materials? How can we use a bill of materials to help us understand what's in these devices, gain some visibility to be able to respond?
There
Larry,
we
I know
go. Now we're tying it back to the U.S. elections and the CHIPS
That's
Act.
right. That's right.
Way to come full circle. This is
I'm full circle on that. But Evan's got a great point, right? The U.S. government specifically is got a hard push for bills of materials. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think an SBOM is all about what you do with it, but we have to get the information first, right? And these devices, Larry, you do a lot of work in this area. A lot of times they don't come with a bill of materials.
Nope. Or if they do, it's restricted. You have to specifically ask for it. I mean, you look at some of the work about a year ago that my boss did with one of our customers, and the biggest challenge was getting the manufacturers to give up an SBOM.
Mm-hmm.
Like the hardest challenge to doing any of the security stuff that required an SBOM was getting the manufacturer to give up an SBOM.
Mm-hmm.
And now again, that landscape is changing. That they're being required into certain industries and potentially, more worldwide applicability. But everybody's questioning whether we should be publicly sharing some of that type of stuff.
Right. Knowing is half the battle, though.
Yeah.
And look, I'll give manufacturers kind of a pass on this. Don't get all worked up if you've got old Linux stuff on there that's vulnerable. That's in every appliance and device that I've looked at. There's old Linux stuff. It's okay. Mm-hmm. The reachability and exploitability of that should also come into play, and that's about how you use the SBOM. But at least if there is an SBOM, I know what's on there, and I can then respond. Right now, we're in this lack of visibility is what attackers are preying upon. So we can somewhat level the playing field just by knowing what's inside the devices.
Yeah, and then Paul, to exactly some of that stuff. That was the kind of the meat of my presentation last year at RSAC was SBOMs for evil. Was that if you're producing SBOMs to enable your customers to know what's inside their stuff, you should, as a manufacturer, you should also be using those so that you know what's inside your stuff, enrich them so you know what vulnerabilities may be present and can determine reachability and can comment on said reachability so that you can improve your process. So the next release, before you're even releasing those SBOMs as part of the development lifecycle, you're fixing the problems as you're going on, as you're discovering them at time of development.
We're reducing attack surface, which is largely what we're about in security, right? Reduce that attack surface.
Yep. You'll probably never eliminate it, but you can certainly manage and reduce it.
Well, awesome. Anything else to add on this topic? Closing thoughts, as it were.
My cat apparently has something they want to add, but that's okay.
Definitely, for sure.
No closing thoughts other than what's already been said. I think the attacker is resourced and motivated, and again, just kudos to Sophos for kind of changing the model and making it more expensive for the operators to operate. I think that's ultimately how we're going to win this game. It's not by sitting back and just waiting for them to get us. It's going to have to be something that disrupts the model. So kudos to Sophos for taking that first step.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks for
Yep.
Sophos for all this information and being transparent about it. It's what it's all about. So,
Yep.
Larry, Evan, thank you. Oh, sorry, Larry, closing
Oh
thoughts.
yeah, no, I think Sophos's release of this information being transparent is really a game changer, and I hope it really changes the way we start interacting with these devices, changes the way how manufacturers think about this stuff, and
Yeah.
so I applaud them for being open and transparent, and hopefully it really is that game changer.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thanks, Larry. Thanks, Evan, for participating in this episode of Below the Surface. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.